यमुना तीरा वनचारी
राधा माधव कुंज बिहारी
जय राधा माधव कुंज बिहारी
गोपी जन वल्लभ शिवरधारी
जय गोपी जन वल्लभ गिरिवरधारी
यशोदनन्दन भज जनरञ्जना
यशोदानन्दन भज जनरञ्जन
यमुना तीरा वनचारी
यमुना तीरा वनचारी
जय राधा माधव कुंज बिहारी
जय राधा माधव कुंज बिहारी
कृष्ण हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे
हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे
हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे
हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे
हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे
हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे
जय राधा कुंज बिहारी राधा कुंज बिहारी राधे
राधा कुंज बिहारी राधा कुंज बिहारी राधे
जय राधा दामोदर राधा दामोदर राधे
जय राधा दामोदर राधा दामोदर राधे
जय जगन्नाथ जय हरदेवा मही सुभद्रा
जय जगन्नाथ जय जगन्नाथ जय हरदेवा मही सुभद्रा
जय श्रीनाथ जी जय बाल गोपाल जय श्रीनाथ जी जय गिरि गोवर्धन
जय श्रीनाथ जी जय बाल गोपाल जय श्रीनाथ जी जय गिरि गोवर्धन
जय गौरनिताय जय गौरनिताय जय गौरनिताय जय गौरनिताय
जय गौरनिताय जय गौरनिताय जय गौरनिताय जय गौरनिताय
जय प्रभुपदा जय प्रभुपदा जय प्रभुपदा जय प्रभुपदा
जय प्रभुपदा जय प्रभुपदा जय प्रभुपदा जय प्रभुपदा
जय गुरुदेवा जय गुरुदेवा जय गुरुदेवा जय गुरुदेवा
जय गुरुदेवा जय गुरुदेवा जय
अनंत कोटि वैष्णव वृंद। ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय।
ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय।
ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय।
ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय।
ओम ज्ञानातिमिरन्धस्य ज्ञानाञ्जनशलाकया चक्षुरुन्मिलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः। श्रीचैतन्यमनोभीष्टं स्थापितं येन भूतले स्वयं रूपा कदा मह्यं ददाति स्वपदान्तिकम्। वन्देऽहं श्रीगुरो श्रीयुक्तापदकमलं श्रीगुरुन् वैष्णवांश्च श्रीरूपं साग्रजातं सहगना रघुनाथं तं सजीवं साद्वैतं सावधूतं परिजनसहितं कृष्णचैतन्यदेवं श्रीराधा कृष्णपदान् सहगना ललिता श्रीविशाखान्वितं च। हे कृष्ण करुणा सिन्धु दीनबन्धो जगत्पते गोपेश गोपिकान्त राधाकान्त नमोऽस्तुते। तप्तकाञ्चन गौराङ्गी राधे वृन्दावनेश्वरी वृषभानुसुते देवी प्रणमामि हरिप्रिये। वाञ्छाकल्पतरुभ्यश्च कृपा सिन्धुभ्येव च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः। नमो विष्णुपदाय कृष्णपृष्ठाय भूतले श्रीमते भक्तिवेदान्त स्वामिनिति नामिने। नमस्ते सरस्वती देवे गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे निर्विशेष शून्यवादी पाश्चात्यदेशकारिणे। जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौर भक्तवृंद। हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे। Hare Krishna. So, we have been discussing chapter 13, the nature of the enjoyer in consciousness. And Prabhupada has explained one of Arjuna's questions in the beginning of this chapter is about knowledge. He wants to know knowledge, right? And so Prabhupada says, which knowledge can give us the perfection of life? He says, one can relish the nectar of life when they understand three things. Anybody remember those three things? Any one of the three?
The object of knowledge.
What is the object? Yeah? What is it?
It's Krishna.
Yeah?
That's all. I don't know.
He says that one has to know about the distinction between the body and the soul. Right? The Kshetra and the Kshetragya. But beyond the soul, there's also, that knowledge is not complete. Okay? Just knowing I am not matter and I am spirit isn't complete. I need to know one more thing, which is the super soul. Okay? So that by knowing the super soul, I understand my relationship, my understanding of how I exist in this world and in the spiritual world. Okay? So Krishna has been establishing in the last couple of verses the nature of the super soul and the principal overarching understanding that Krishna is trying to make us understand and help us understand with several verses. Sometimes it seems like kind of saying the same thing. Well, in some ways he is, but it's to give a different angle of vision to the same point to help convince us of one thing, that we and the super soul are not the same. They're not the same. There is duality. There is two. There's a distinction between the soul and the super soul. And it sounds, on one hand, maybe somewhat of a trivial topic, but actually, it's a point of great confusion in philosophical circles, and one that, if one doesn't understand it very clearly, puts one in a very difficult or dangerous situation. So this understanding that there's a distinction between the soul and the super soul. And Krishna has spoken that the soul is subordinate to Krishna. Right? The soul is subordinate to Krishna. And of course we said, as soon as we hear that, we think, oh man, why I can't be that, right? Everyone's trying to one-up everybody else. That's the nature of the material world. But in the spiritual world, it's the opposite. Everybody wants to be the servant, because the servant is one who actually enjoys unlimitedly. But one must be acknowledged. Yes, I'm subordinate. So Krishna then, after saying that, is explaining different concepts of the super soul. So it's one thing to say it, but there's another thing to explain it in detail. Right? So in last week's verse, Krishna said, everywhere are his hands and legs, his eyes, head, and faces, his ears everywhere. In this way, the super soul exists, pervading everything. Can we see everything? We can't even see what's just around the corner, right? We don't even know. We can't even see just a few feet up above us. We have no idea what's going on. So our vision is very limited. But Krishna is present and pervasive everywhere. Even we say, well, I know my own body, right? So I have knowledge of my body, you have not. So each soul knows its own body. But Krishna knows everyone's. But even in our own body, do we know like what's happening in our liver right now? Anybody knows? Do we know what's happening inside our heart, or what's happening in our toe up here? Sometimes we wonder what's happening up here. But we don't know. Even our own body, we have such limited knowledge of. But Krishna's knowledge is complete, all pervading, meaning there's nothing beyond his purview. Even what's happening in our toe, Krishna has full and complete knowledge of it. May not matter to him, but he knows nonetheless. So there's a stark difference between us and Krishna. And it's actually that lack of understanding of that faith, of that fact, which brings us to the material world in the first place. Yeah. Because we are trying to enjoy here separate from Krishna. But actually, everything we are trying to enjoy are fully dependent on Krishna. Whatever he is providing in terms of maintenance, support, facilities, we are fully dependent on. And we see it now, right? Our whole lives have been upturned in unimaginable ways, beyond comprehension, by some virus that we don't really understand. We can't even see it, but it's shaken our whole existence. And it's a good reminder. It's a really good reminder that our existence here, we are not independent in what we're doing. We are fully dependent. It may strive for this independent existence, but it's not going to happen. And this knowledge of knowing soul and supersoul is the supreme knowledge. Right now, so much emphasis and value is being placed on the knowledge of how to combat this virus. You know, companies will make billions of dollars in producing a vaccine, right? And we think that'll be it. Then life will be back to normal. But what was happening before this virus? So much conflict, so much disease, so many other struggles and challenges. They were there. It's just a new set of them, maybe a little bit more advanced. And what's the greatest fear? We solved this virus, but then what? Something else. Are we certain something else is coming? Yeah? We are. It's always happened that way. Right? So this knowledge, it has no real ultimate value. It has some relative value. So this is the knowledge that really opens our eyes to the perfection of life. So Krishna in the 15th verse now that we'll read today is going to describe more features of the supersoul. Again, to further cement in our understanding the single point, we are subordinate to the supersoul. Someone wants to read the verse?
Sarvendriya gunabhasham sarvendriya vivajitam aksaptam sarvabhajaiva nirgunam gunabhaktacha. The supersoul is the original source of all senses, yet he is without senses. He is unattached, although he is the maintainer of all living beings. He transcends the modes of material nature, and at the same time, he is the master of all the modes of material nature.
Purport?
The Supreme Lord, although the source of all the senses of the living entities, doesn't have material senses like they have. Actually, the individual souls have spiritual senses, but in conditioned life, they are covered with material elements, and therefore, the sense activities are exhibited through matter. The Supreme Lord's senses are not so covered. His senses are transcendental and are therefore called nirguna. Guna means material modes, but his senses are without any material covering. It should be understood that his senses are not exactly like ours. Although he is the source of all our sensory activities, he has his transcendental senses, which are uncontaminated. This is very nicely explained in the Svetasvara Upanishad 390, in the verse Apanipado Jovano Grihata. The Supreme Personality of Godhead has no hands which are materially contaminated, but he has his hands and accepts whatever sacrifice is offered to him. That is the distinction between the conditioned soul and the supersoul. He has no material eyes, but he has eyes. Otherwise, how could he see? He sees everything, past, present, and future. He lives within the heart of the living being, and he knows what we have done in the past, what we are doing now, and what is awaiting us in the future. This is also confirmed in the Bhagavad Gita. He knows everything, but no one knows him. It is said that the Supreme Lord has no legs like us, but he can travel throughout space, because he has spiritual legs. In other words, the Lord is not impersonal. He has his hands, legs, he has his eyes, legs, hands, and everything else. And because we are a part and parcel of the Supreme Lord, we also have these things. But his hands, legs, eyes, and senses are not contaminated by material nature.
Bhagavad Gita also confirms that when the Lord appears, he appears as he is. He appears as he is by internal clemency. He is not contaminated by material energy because he is the Lord of material energy. In the Vedic literature, we find that his whole embodiment is spiritual. He has his eternal form called Satchitananda Vigraha. He is full of opulence. He is the proprietor of all wealth and the owner of all energy. He is the most intelligent and full of knowledge. These are some of the symptoms of the personality, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He is the maintainer of all living entities and the witness of all activity. As far as we can understand from Vedic literature, the Supreme Lord is always transcendental. Although we do not see his head, face, hands, or legs, he has them, and when we are elevated to the transcendental situation, we can see the Lord's form. Due to materially contaminated senses, we cannot see his form. Therefore, the impersonalists who are still materially affected cannot understand the personality of Godhead.
Alright, so Krishna says the super soul is the original source of all the senses, yet he is without senses. He is unattached, although he is the maintainer of all living beings. He transcends the modes of nature, and at the same time, he is the master of all the modes of material nature. So Krishna here is explaining that he's giving almost some contradictions, or like simultaneously, one and different, right? He's giving this sort of sense. So, does Krishna have senses?
Yes.
But he says he is without senses.
He's without material senses.
He is without material senses. And so what are his senses?
Transcendental.
They're transcendental. They are made up of
Spirit.
spirit. You know, take our eyes. Eyes are made up of matter, right? Different elements, cellular structures. It's matter, right? But Krishna's eyes, we see eyes, they look similar. Oh, he has eyes. But his eyes are made up of spirit. Does Krishna have arms? Do we have arms? Are they the same?
Oh no.
When Krishna is sitting like this, does his foot fall asleep? Why does our foot fall asleep?
Blood flow.
Material blood flow.
There's blood flow, right? There's a machinery. Is there any blood flow in Krishna's body? There's no need to carry oxygen to different parts of the body, right? Blood flow is simply for carrying oxygen to fuel the body, right? So, bringing energy, everything. So, Krishna's body is not machinery. It is fully spiritual. So when Krishna eats, there's no stomach and digestive tract. It's hard for it to contemplate. Well, where does the food go? It's spiritual, right? So that's just. But what about us? Do we have the same senses?
Same.
Imperfect material senses. With our senses, we are very limited. We cannot see so many things. Right? There are radio waves going on here. Can anybody see them? You cannot see them. If you turn off the lights and you hold something just 1 foot in front of your face, can you see it? So actually our senses are very limited. But no, I'm the controller. We think, but actually our senses are very limited. Right, so again, the distinction here is Krishna has no material senses, but we have material senses. But actually, what are our original senses?
Spiritual.
Huh?
Spiritual.
Spiritual. The jiva also has original spiritual senses. But what's happened to them?
Cut off.
Covered, we can say. Right? So they're covered by conditioning. Right? So, with our eyes, our material eyes, when we see the deity, we don't necessarily see Krishna. We may get some realization of Krishna. But why we don't see? Because Krishna is actually there. So because our eyes, we're observing with our materially anointed eyes. Okay? So Prabhupada says at the end of the purport, due to materially contaminated senses, we cannot see his form. But the pure devotee, with their spiritual senses, can see. Prabhupada was asked, Prabhupada, do you see the deities eating? He says, yes, I can see. But you cannot. But you will, if you continue to purify. Right? So the living entity also has these very potent senses. They're very, very powerful. Right? And we know Krishna's senses are multifaceted. What does that mean? What's an example of that?
The same sense can do so many other things as well.
Like? Can you give me an example?
Eat through the eyes or hear through the nose.
Someone brings you a nice plate of prasad. You're satisfied just by seeing it?
Not me.
Not you. Not me either. We must taste it. Our sight is not sufficiently satisfied. We cannot eat with our eyes. But Krishna can. Krishna can see with his ears. All the senses perform all the different activities, whereas our senses are one-dimensional. So again, the nature of that must be understood. So Krishna is saying that the super soul is the original source of all senses. That's why we call Krishna Rishikesh. He is actually the master of our senses. Where our senses came from. Where did our eyes and our ears and our tongue and we can say at a minimum we'll say it came from nature, right? Came from nature. But who is the master of the nature? So he says that in the last line of this verse. Right? Yeah, you think you got this body from nature, but who arranged nature? Somebody. When a car comes off the assembly line, it's a fully automated assembly line, right? Full automation. Car comes off. But we know that the equipment in the factory didn't ultimately make that car. Who made the car? How many people are involved in making that car? People in your profession, right? Programming. So many people are there behind managing the machine, programming, writing software, right? But to the observer, oh, the car just came from this machinery. But we know behind that automation is a person. So behind the so-called automation of the nature around us, we say, oh no, nature is creating all these different living entities, and trees grow from the wind blowing seeds to a certain area and rain coming, and we see all this so-called automation. But just like that factory doesn't spit out cars without the involvement of very intelligent persons to arrange all the facilities, there is a supreme person arranging all of this, right? So Krishna is saying that he is beyond the modes of nature, but he is the master. What does it mean he is beyond the modes of nature?
No conditioning affects him.
Yes, no conditioning affects him. We can liken this to, this is kind of a crude example, stepping into a pool and not getting wet. Krishna can step into the material world and nothing can touch him. He's not affected by the all-pervasive material nature. Whereas as soon as we enter the material world, engulfed. Okay? So again, in that crude example, just a way to think about it, Krishna is transcendental to the modes. Right? So Prabhupada says in the second paragraph that the Lord appears. By what force does the Lord appear? By whose?
By his own will.
Huh?
By his own will.
By his own will.
So,
Okay? Prabhupada says, by his internal potency. Did you appear by your internal potency? Any of you got to pick your birthday? Any of you got to pick where you were born? What determined when we were born, where we were born, to whom we were born? What determined that? Our past karma. And who carried out that order of karma? Modes of material nature. So nature is the instrument, the means. What made that vehicle? You can say the factory, the robots were putting it all together. That was the tangible cause we can see, but not the ultimate cause. That ultimate cause is a supersoul. So our senses are different. Our even cause of existence is very different. So again, just different ways Krishna is explaining that the supersoul is the supreme knower. What does the supersoul know? Everything. He knows past and future. Past, present, and future. Now that's knowledge. That is knowledge. We barely know present. If you want to know, can we remember exactly what we were thinking about 5 minutes ago? Even 5 minutes ago, we cannot remember what thought was in our mind. So our knowledge of past, Arjun, you took a history test today, right? What kind of history we really know? Very limited. But Krishna has perfect knowledge of past. Now this knowledge of future, sometimes this is a little bewildering. Any concerns arise in your mind when we think, wait a minute, Krishna knows the future?
Can you share it with us?
Maybe someone else does. Yes, I will, ultimately. If Krishna knows the future, sometimes there's one concern that resides within us. What are we worried we might be losing? Think.
The future is not in our control.
Yes. Yes. So someone might think, oh, wait a minute, I'm already pre-programmed to do all these things because Krishna knows it. Right? So then what's the point? I'm already destined to X, Y, or Z. As Krishna says, I know the future. But that is not. Krishna knows, his knowledge is so perfect that he knows in the future how we will exercise our free will. That's what is perplexing and beyond comprehension. So that because Krishna knows what we are going to do, doesn't mean we don't have the free will to do that, right? I'll use another crude example. I know that if there are a bowl of cookies out, someone unnamed will eat them. I know it's going to happen. But my knowing that it's going to happen doesn't mean I'm forcing or programming that person to take them. Again, a crude example. But so Krishna knowing the future doesn't mean we are already pre-programmed. But he knows how we are going to exercise our minute free will at each step of our journey. And that's the staggering depth of Krishna's knowledge. Again, all these different angles, simply to bring us to the point, we are a servant to Krishna. That is it. But we see this in many different features of this. Krishna says in this verse, he is unattached, although the maintainer of all living beings. How do you feel about that? He is unattached. How does that compare to us?
Letting you exercise your own free will, essentially. He's not pushing you in a certain direction.
He is definitely not pushing you. So his presence everywhere doesn't mean he is simply observing. He is not interrupting our journey. Right? He is simply observing. And when we want to, remember, reach him, he is sitting right next to us. And then if we don't, he'll also facilitate that. But this point of he is unattached, although he is the maintainer. How does that compare to us?
We have attachments and we can barely, I guess, maintain ourselves. To maintain others. He can maintain everything. He's maintaining everything.
He is maintaining everything. Yet, he's detached. He has nothing to gain or lose from the developments of this material world. Because he has everything situated fully in the spiritual world. We are working to try to gain something from this material world. So whatever we are quote unquote maintaining, we remain attached to. Right? But Krishna, his maintenance is so imagine everything was operating under your direction, under your control. Yet how to be detached from that? You have some giant operation, some big company or some big program or whatever it is. Yet I'm detached. It's difficult. But Krishna, he is maintaining even the small microorganisms and what they are doing. Everything, giant of giant operations, yet detached. So again, we have a lot of comparing and contrasting we can do to the same point. Here, that the Lord is supreme. And ultimately, Prabhupada says, we can understand from Shastra, from Vedic literature, this point. So Krishna is making this point. In the next verse, Krishna says that the supreme truth exists outside and inside of all living beings, the moving and the non-moving. Because he is subtle, he is beyond the power of material senses to see or know. Although far, far away, he is also near to all. Can we be far and near? We try to with like FaceTime and video chats and things like that, right? But is it the same? It's not. So Krishna's potency is such, he can be far and near at the same time. And we saw some of these seemingly contradictions earlier in chapter 10, right? And even in parts of chapter 9. But just a different, way of thinking about this. Again, the supreme truth exists outside and inside, sitting inside our hearts, outside in the form of all of his different energies. It's all pervasive nature. So these verses will continue discussing the super soul. And next week we'll talk a little bit about the dividing among the super soul. So, any questions or comments on today's topic?
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
You said that we are like in a way not pre-programmed, but basically Krishna knows everything what's going to happen in our future too, right? So, but then at the same time, many times you have also mentioned earlier that he's waiting for us to go back to him, and he's really craving for us to come back. So, but he knows each of the souls, what is their journey and when they're going to come back, right? So, why will he be so much in pain? Because he knows everybody's journey. He knows when the person is coming back.
Love. When we are missing somebody and we know they're not going to come, still there is feeling of desire for association with that person. Even though I know I cannot see them, I still have hankering. That of love.
But he's not disappointed because he knows that the person is not coming back soon.
He's not disappointed, but he is expressing his desire, and he is saddened, we can say, to some degree, because he is missing the association of his devotee. Krishna is not aloof to that. Oh, they don't want to be with me? Forget them. So he doesn't detach from the sentiment of the living entities.
But I'm not able to fathom this concept, or the fact that he knows the future, that in the concept of free will, then we should not even talk about free will. There's no free will as such, because when it's already we know what mistakes we are going to commit, and that is now beyond our control. Even if I'm trying that, it's already...
That's the point. That the future, Krishna knowing the future doesn't mean you lose your ability to choose. He knows how we are going to exercise our free will throughout. So Krishna knowing it doesn't impact our decisions that I'm going to make. If I'm going to make a good decision tomorrow and do something, yeah, Krishna knows that I'm going to do that, but that doesn't, Krishna's knowledge of it isn't what's leading me to do it. It's my choice, my decision, my free will to accept that activity. But Krishna has knowledge of how we are going to, which decisions we're going to make. So you're not pre-programmed. Pre-programmed would be that whatever decision we make, Krishna is making that decision for us. So we have to separate, and the reason is unfathomable. It's natural. Why? Because it's beyond our ability, right? It's not something we can kind of grasp, because we can't understand how, one, even knowing the future itself is impossible for us, right? But just like I gave the example of the cookies, right? If I know somebody's going to eat those cookies, my knowledge of that has nothing to do with whether that person chooses to take those or not. So we separate not knowing what's going to happen with our free will is eternal. It is never subjugated. If there was no free will, then of course Krishna would have us all in the spiritual world, because that's his desire. That is Krishna's desire. But he never forces or imposes his desire upon us. Our presence here is not Krishna's desire. His desire is to enjoy with each and every living entity in the spiritual world. Keep going.
Just a comment on this thing. So, can I imagine this as a big flow chart? And just take one individual. These are the free wills that I'm exercising. I'm doing this. This is what is going to happen. If I don't do this, this is what is happening. So what Krishna knows is whichever path I take, how am I going to end up with?
Yeah.
So I, as an individual, am exercising my free will, going down a particular route. What Krishna knows is the future, that if you take this route, this is what is going to happen. If you take this route, this is what is going to happen. So he knows the full future of a big giant flowchart for each individual. He knows whatever path he takes, where is he going to end up and when.
Yeah, but only distinction I'll say is he knows which, am I going to go left or right? Not only what are the consequences of if I go left or if I go right, but he also knows which one.
Correct. So to Palika's question as to if he knows, then why do it? He is forcing himself. There's no free will, as I understood the question. So here I'm exercising the free will to go down that particular path of the flow chart, and Krishna knows which I'm going to take.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm still exercising my free will,
Yeah,
and he still knows my future.
of course. There's no distinction. Because knowledge of it and what decision you take are not mutually exclusive. They coexist. They coexist perfectly well, right? So just take the opposite, okay? Krishna not knowing, let's say Krishna doesn't know. It doesn't change anything about all the different options we're going to take in the just take real simple, tomorrow. Forget about just what I'm going to do tomorrow. Right? Is whether Krishna knows or doesn't know, it has no bearing on what I'm going to do. So we talk about, let's take this a little bit further, you know, my karma has set me down a certain path. And we say that, wait a minute, but you can change your destiny through the association of a pure devotee, by taking the process of Krishna consciousness, and I may be headed down this path, but I can get nicely associated and go that way, right? So now we can say, wait a minute, my future is changing, right? Yes, but that change also Krishna knows is going to happen. So it's not that, yes, that path now, just because it's known, it's fixed. No, we can reshape our future destiny by the decisions we make today. We can reshape those all along. What Krishna understands is what decisions we're going to make, what choices we'll make all along the way. So that is what his knowledge is. You know, I'll give one more, again, crude example, just to, you have a chef who has made a buffet items of foodstuffs, and 5 patrons come, and he knows this one's going to take these 4 items, this one's going to take those 3 items, that one's going to take those 2 items. His knowledge of that, sitting far away, has no bearing on which items they take. He just knows which ones are going to take. Right? So that knowledge and the actions are decoupled. That's what we have to, and that's why I wanted to bring up that point, because then, and as soon as we hear this, Krishna knows the future, we can sometimes go to that. Well, what's the point then? Everything's already known and determined. It doesn't negate our free will.
Okay, now
That makes sense. Yeah. Thank you, Brian, because that's a very often people, when we get to that topic, it can be frustrated, right? Because well, what is the point then?
but this is really very, very inconceivable actually.
It is. And that point is inconceivable, how great and far beyond our intellectual capability the super soul is, and ultimately Krishna is, right? That you gave the example of the flow chart. Every moment we have so many options. How complicated that flow chart is not, you can't put it on paper. And yet Krishna knows what each, not only us, the living entities, the ant, the cockroach, the tree, like the permutations. And that's just one planet within millions of planets, within one universe, within unlimited number of everything. And now we get to things, just we left concluding one thing. We are tiny. And Krishna is supreme.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, I guess I'm trying to figure out how I ask this question. I don't even know. So does the soul have, so the constitutional position of the soul, the jiva, the super soul, is devotional service as part and parcel of. Does the soul, as the soul itself, have a form, a personality, a personified sort of essence that, like, even though we're transmigrated throughout time and space, throughout the physical cosmos, what is that sort of form of the soul itself, not the person? And then my next question to that is, when we use the metaphor like the soul is a diamond that's shoved in the mud, and so the form that we are now is the mud over the diamond, and the diamond is the soul, does that also apply to gross elements like earth, air, fire, water, ether? And if so, do those gross physical elements have a placement somewhere within a spiritual space? And does that spiritual space
if you were to just sort of, take away all the material, would it all still be there minus the material? Would it be like just this?
Yeah, let me answer your first question, which is, so the soul also has a shape. It's not impersonal. And that shape is whatever form the jiva has in the spiritual world. Because we all have an eternal form.
So now so with that, let me add a quick question then. So when we say that to have an impersonal relationship with God would be an inanimate object in the spiritual world, so a plate, for example, would have an impersonal relationship to God because it serves the purpose of being a plate, as to where in this world a plate's just a plate. If you drop it, it breaks. It has no purpose other than just a plate.
Yeah, it's not quite impersonal, because the service is still to Krishna as a person, but it's the rasa specifically is one of neutrality. So it's not a expressive service, right? So where one is expressing a personality or a different, what we call a nature, it is neutral. Neutral meaning it doesn't express itself. It's a plate.
Right.
But it is living. It has a consciousness.
Right. In the spiritual world.
In the spiritual world.
Okay.
So the shape of our soul is whatever form we have in the spiritual world. So, and that shape has been compressed by the material nature, by the energy. By the energy of the material world, and so now we have a shape, right? But this shape, this form, is based on the interactions with the modes of material nature. So based on how we interact with the modes, we get different shapes and styles of body. It is not based on the shape of my soul.
Okay.
It is based on what activities I do. So I might have a human body next. Now I might have a tree body. I might have, a male body, female body, all kinds of different shapes. It's not based on the shape of the soul. It's based on the interaction of the soul through conditioning with material nature, and that's the laws of karma that leads to the body. So now the material element, so the diamond and the mud, a little bit more specific, is the mud is the conditioning that covers the soul's understanding that I am not this body, I am eternal servant of Krishna. So it's not quite the body. The mud is not quite the body. It is the conditioning of material nature. And so it gets a little subtle at that point. Right? The body is simply a manifestation of my false ego conditioning in the material world. As soon as I come to the material world, I must acquire, my spiritual body shrinks down and I acquire some material body. And there are 8.4 million types of material bodies. And those one takes based on their different activities and desires. But in the spiritual world, the elements, the gross elements don't exist. There's no place for them, because those material elements have a purpose of carrying out the activities with the material modes of nature. But in the spiritual world, one resumes their spiritual form. And that spiritual form is also Sat, Chit, and Ananda. It's not earth, air, fire, water, ether, which is what this form is made out of. Okay? But in the spiritual world, the form is Sat, Chit, and Ananda. That is the composition of that. Those are the ingredients. So there is no presence of those elements. To simply create the universes, those elements are created and sent into motion and impregnated, if you will, into the creation. Speaking very generally, there's more specific description of how that happens.
Right.
Through Karna Daksha Vishnu and his glance over the Mahatattva and the whole Pradhan, and it's a very detailed. But so that's the material elements. They only serve a function here. There's no function in the spiritual world.
So then the form of this soul in the spirit world, what is that based on then? If our form now is based off of conditioning throughout the three modes of material nature, then what is it based on?
It's based on one's service relationship with the Supreme Lord.
So then is it possible to then say, like, in the spirit world, I could be a rock or a tree or anything?
You
that
could
would
be anything. You could be a peacock, you could be a gopi, you could be a gopa, you could be a tree, you could be anything.
And so,
And those are all eternally fulfilling. So the unique nature of the spiritual world is that whatever rasa we have with Krishna, to us, it's the most perfect. There's never I wish I was that. I wish I was this, right? In the material world, we always wish we had something someone else has that we don't.
right.
But in the spiritual world, one is so completely content. There is no, I'm a tree, but I wish I was this. Because as soon as the wish is desired, it's fulfilled, because there are desire trees everywhere. There's no, there's not even a moment of lack of full satisfaction, contentment. So it's again hard for us to perceive some of these things, because we're trying to relate it to what we know in the spiritual world, and that's why this knowledge, it all comes from Shastra. How do I know my soul has a shape? Well, you can't with a microscope, no. But from Shastra you can know. We can't figure out how this plate could have life, right? But it does. The stones in the walking path of Krishna, when the stone sees Krishna coming, it busts itself into fine dust, so that when Krishna's foot steps on it, it's a nice pillowy powder. And as soon as Krishna's foot steps back up, it reassembles into a stone. Yeah, it's like, oh, okay, that's cute. That's what the immature material mind says. That's bogus. That's reality. But it's inconceivable. But that's the nature of service, even of the stone. The cloud in the sky, it moves according to where Krishna is to provide the optimal amount of shade and sun. But wait a minute, why there be clouds in the sky? Is that to give the natural variety that exists? The breezes, the wind, the river, they're all in the service of Krishna. When Krishna is feeling a little bit too warm, a few drops of sprinkled water come from the clouds. All this is explained in Brihad Bhagavatam. It's very sweet to hear and see how these different relationships, these rasas, are all engaged in service of Krishna in the spiritual world. And it's a very, very deep and very complete description of what it's like. So nothing left to our imagination, which is, as soon as now you can understand why, if we let our imagination think, we'll be way off. Because our minds are so tiny. We'll never fully be able to estimate the potency of the spiritual world. So that's why surrendering to Shastra, and that's why Prabhupada says here, right? Due to the materially contaminated senses, we cannot see his form. You have a question?
Yeah. Hare Krishna Prabhu, is there any reference in Srimad Bhagavatam about human beings' existence in this universe other than Earth?
Yes, of course. There are all the heavenly planets are all jiva tattvas. Remember, there are 400,000 species of humans. We think, wait a minute, there's one human race, right? No, many gradations of human forms of life. So there are elevated human forms of life in the higher planetary systems, and then there are lower grades of life in the lower planetary systems. So humans do not exist just on this earthly planet. But they're not like aliens like we see in the sci-fi movies. That's all mental speculation.
But Prabhupada says that in Sana also you have those living entities who they have.
Yeah, why not? He says, if we think out, if a body can live in water, living entity can live in the air, live on the ground, why not in the sun? Of course, the body would be suitable to be able to be in that environment. But yes, even in the sun, there are different living entities. Certainly not of this type, right? This composition.
I was wondering, Prabhuji, just talking about the desire trees. Just if we have, that's why Krishna did not give a desire tree on earth, because then we will all be like, after that, to satisfy our own senses so much. So that's why it's only in the spiritual world, because then we know all our desires, we are fully satisfied, and we'll be using it only for his service to please him.
The desire tree is not one's personal desire. It's for in the service of Krishna. So, but actually, in some way, there is a desire tree here. It's a super. He is sitting, waiting to fulfill our desires. So, in some ways, Krishna is there in our hearts. Sometimes we wonder, how I'll purify, how I'll be. We have to desire very strongly, and it will happen. Because Krishna is sitting in our hearts as Paramatma to witness and hear those desires. Sometimes we wonder, is Krishna hearing me? He knows what's going on in our toe. Well, he doesn't, you don't think he's not what's going on in our head? He has all knowledge, complete, perfect, past, present, future. So whatever desires, Krishna hears them. Sometimes we wonder, I've been misunderstood. But remember, Krishna never misunderstands us. He knows everything perfectly. Someone else may not know, but Krishna knows. He knows the good and also the bad. We may cover up the bad, but Krishna knows. And that's both comforting and to some scary. But that's a fact. Okay? So rest assured, Krishna is sitting there waiting to fulfill our desires. And he hears our prayers unequivocally. Because he is there. Sometimes we wonder, is he hearing me? Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Shall we pray to him and desire by chanting? So Prabhupada ki jai.